Right, it's a great pleasure to be here, the other side of the world from where most of you are. This is, I'm going to go through the last 300 years of migration and language. What have we learned? So what I want to do is to start off with sort of the beginnings in a way, obviously not the beginning, but with the Atlantic slave trade. And you'll see reasons why I'm doing that in due course. Okay, so this had led to dramatic social and linguistic developments. And sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I can see my own slides. All right, I can see them now. There was enslavement and transportation of Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas generally, North and South America. From a linguistic point of view, well, there were new languages appearing. And what I want to do is to actually explore some of this before we move on to more theoretical matters. So to take this as a background to the current situation. And you'll also notice that I'm actually going to be concentrating on the Atlantic area, so Western Europe and the Caribbean, the North Atlantic, I should say. So not South America and not really Asia, except right at the end, you'll spot Asia coming in. So, okay, now, slavery and the development of Western Europe and USA, there was a very intimate. The slave trade was actually crucial in developing the economies of the West. So we're dealing with countries like Spain, Portugal, France, Netherlands, UK, and Denmark as well. So the reason for this was the cheap labor that was then made available. It sounds like, you know, there was just a sort of a labor shortage, so they brought in some people, but of course we're talking about slavery here, so quite a different thing. It was extremely lucrative, and there's built up huge wealth in Europe, and also for the white colonists in the Caribbean, as well as in the US and Brazil. And this wealth funded economic developments throughout the 19th century, even after the abolition of the slave trade, which took place in the early 19th century in Britain, and slightly later in other European countries and in their colonies. Britain's Industrial Revolution was built on this, and that's something I'm going to be returning to. So let's begin with the triangular route. Okay, many of you have probably seen a map like this before. So we have the European colonial countries, Britain, Spain, Portugal, France. And so there was the export of manufactured products, and this was, of course, the product of the Industrial Revolution. And then we had the return import of things like tobacco, sugar from the Caribbean and the Americas towards Europe. And the thing that was driving all this was the importation of populations from West Africa. Now, this map only shows the Gulf of Guinea, essentially, but as the whole of the western seaboard of Africa, right down to the south. And this map also only shows the northern part of the triangular route, not the bit that involved South America, which is actually apparently involved more people, in fact, than the northern one. The northern one is the one that's perhaps more prominent in people's minds. This is Cape Coast Castle in the Gold Coast, now Ghana. This was a British 17th century trading station, which then also became the capital city of the Gold Coast colony. In the 18th century, it was used as a holding station for enslaved people, and it's a very interesting visit, and of course, rather well, more than sad, but anyway, there it is, an attractive building, and it's salutary to visit these places in Ghana. What about language en route? Well, the slave ship owners tried to ensure slaves didn't all speak the same language. There's quite good evidence for this, and the reason was, of course, so that they couldn't really communicate with each other and create an insurrection on board. Nonetheless, that did happen. There were insurrections. And in terms of the sort of language change, there was language mixing to some extent on the passage, which would take about 6 weeks. Then moving on to Jamaica, I'll be focusing on Jamaica, as you'll see as we go along. So the top picture here depicts a British plantation in the 18th century. I suppose they're dealing with sugar cane here. And then even after slavery, you have quite a similar economy. So at the bottom picture then is sugarcane cutters in Jamaica in 1891, so 130 years ago. So these people are not slaves, but they are the descendants of slaves, direct descendants in many cases. So the economy remained sort of very polarized, if you like, in the Caribbean. Okay, what kind of sociolinguistic consequences can we expect here? So there would have been new structures based on the labor of enslaved people, based on labor and the enslaved peoples on the plantations. So there were divisions, obviously, based on slavery, but segregation wasn't always total. And we know from the United States that there were areas where there was a good deal of contact between the slaves and then the descendants of slaves in the 19th century, and the black people and the white people. So there was, and that was one of the means by which African American English arose. I'm not going to be talking about that though. Anyway, there were new sociolinguistic relationships in these colonies, and we're dealing also with the African colonies as well at a slightly later stage. But in the Caribbean, this led to new languages, Creoles. And just a few words on Creoles now. So this is a list of the Caribbean Creoles that exist today. I won't ask you to read through all of these, but you can see that many are English lexifier, that's the main language, the main sort of input language, or French, or Spanish and Portuguese, or Dutch. In Africa itself, in West Africa and Southern Africa, we have in Sierra Leone the language known as Creole, which is actually a re-imported Creole from the Caribbean and actually from the Americas. Then we have West African Pidgin English, which is very prominent in Nigeria. It's actually almost has the status of a national language there, but it also exists in Ghana, where it's much less prominent. Guinea Creole in Guinea-Bissau, and then we have Mauritian Creole and Seychelles Creole. Okay, and a quick history of Jamaica. So it's before 1500 or so, it was inhabited by a Native American people called the Arawak. Spanish settlement followed, and then British settlement came from the mid 17th century. And then we have settlements then of planters, that is people who were British people who were given land to create sugar plantations. They came from other English colonies, and then the importation of slaves began quite seriously from Africa and also from elsewhere in the Caribbean. In the 17th and 18th century, slaves managed to escape into the mountains and formed separate communities, which to some extent still exist. 1830s abolition of slavery and 1948 independence. So that is a sort of potted history of this particular place. What about the Creoles in the Caribbean? So let's have a quick look at Sranan from Suriname. I'm not going to talk too much about the linguistics of this, but one really interesting feature is the emergence of so-called serial verbs. This is a construction which exists in the Creoles of the Caribbean and in many West African languages. So here's an example from Sranan. Okay, I'll read the English rather than the Sranan. So I throw the stone hit amber, where hit is a verb and throw is a verb. No preposition there. And it translates as I threw a stone at Amber and hit her. In Akan, which is the major language of Ghana, you have a related construction which comes out like this. I threw stone the, I pierced Amma. So we have two verbs. So we have mitao and mebo. So these are both verbs. Again, no preposition here. So it is strongly argued by linguists that this construction in the Caribbean Creoles actually comes from West Africa. Funnily enough, there are not that many other features in the Creoles which can be directly linked to West Africa. A certain amount of vocabulary, certainly, and also personal names. Let's just have a quick look then at some of the structures of some other structures. First of all, the plural system. So the JC, that's Jamaican Creole, the norm is no marking, but dem may be added after a noun, especially ones which refer to people, to show plural. So die gal dem means the girls. Now, some of you might well have been to Britain and realized that in fact quite a lot of young Londoners say gal dem, man dem as well. I'll come back to that, where that comes from in London. It's a recent thing in London. Tense and aspect. Jamaican Creole has aspect markers a and go we, which can combine with the anterior tense marker ben to give combinations like, and I'll just read these out, mi a work, mi ben work, mi ben a work, and mi ben go work. Okay, so you can see that the lexical parts of this clearly come from English, but the actual constructions themselves are pretty remote from English. Okay. So some theoretical considerations now. So I just got something on my screen that said my internet connection was unstable, but we'll plow on. Let me know if there's a problem. So some questions, first of all. How does migration change the receiving community? So people, what happens socially to the countries or the places that get new populations? How does the migration change the social circumstances for the people who've migrated? One thing that is fairly clear is that on the whole, people step down, migrants step down several rungs of the ladder in social terms. So they find that their qualifications are not recognized in the new community, and they end up doing work that lies well below their own qualifications. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but that's something that certainly happens. So, and this is something that's not so often considered, how does migration affect the social circumstances and economies of the donor communities, the communities of origin? What's being argued for in Africa is that there was this sort of loss of the working age population, fit young working age population, especially men, and that still affects the communities today in West Africa. But how are these changes reflected in language change and in changes to language use? So we'll be looking at some of those things now. Migration lies behind much contact-driven language change. And when dealing with migration, it seems to me, we need to consider three factors: demography, community orientation, and multilingual versus monolingual ethos. And I'll explain what I mean by this. Okay, demography, first of all. So the question here to consider is, for the people arriving, which social groups, which languages, and in what proportions, i.e. relative frequencies. So maybe there is just one language group that's moving, and then I'm thinking here of a kind of migration I'm not going to be talking about, and that is settlement migration to places like New Zealand and Australia and South America in the colonial period, where English was transported to Australia, New Zealand, and America before that, of course, and then Spanish to and Portuguese to Latin America. But what if the people concerned speak many different languages, as we're finding in Europe now? The recent migrants speak 100 different languages. And that's true of London, certainly. So secondly, what are the social relations between the new groups and existing groups in terms of hierarchy, power, and cultural factors? So I've already mentioned the idea that people, when they migrate, take a hit when it comes to their social status. But of course, they also have to learn a new language, fit in somehow linguistically and socially and culturally. So these are factors that affect migrants. So community orientation. This is something that's often not really talked about very much. And a Danish linguist called Henning Andersen came up with a framework, which I'm referring to here. So firstly, are communities receptive to outside influences? So in other words, if there are new people around, do they welcome them and copy them, whatever it is, or do they put up sort of psychological barriers to the incomers, or somewhere in between? And secondly, and related to this, do members of the community have a lot of contact with people outside the community? So in other words, is it a small isolated island somewhere, or is it a metropolitan city that's receiving people, or somewhere in between? So you can see that there's going to be a lot of variation due to these two. Firstly, sort of social psychological question, and secondly, actual contact between people. And then thirdly, the idea of a multilingual ethos versus a monolingual ethos. I think by just giving you some examples, I think this will become clear. So the multilingual ethos is as follows. Okay, and you might want to correct me in question time. This might be something that we should look at, is whether the countries you come from, and I realize I'm fairly ignorant actually of the Philippines, and this is most unfortunate, but I don't know too much about it. I have been to Southeast Asia, but not the Philippines or Indonesia. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, that's about it for me, and Southeast Asia. But anyway, in Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other places, we find extensive code switching among the indigenous population. In Africa especially, new styles and language varieties have resulted from migration existing alongside the code switching. So we're dealing then with local migration, okay, within African countries, turning cities into highly multilingual places. So that's the multilingual ethos. The monolingual ethos goes like this. So in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere, there's a strong monolingual ethos that takes monolingualism as the norm and regards multilingual practices as deviant. Migrants are forced to fit in. So I think I'm probably right in saying that Japan and most European countries are in this category. And then I might just refer to a book that Heike Wiese and I have edited. I have in my hand this morning, or the final proofs of this book to have a look at by tomorrow, before it's in print. So that's I'll give you a reference to that later on, but it deals with some of these things. Okay, stepping back, you'll notice I'm going backwards and forwards between Europe and the Americas in this talk. So let's go back to Britain now. The Industrial Revolution in Britain, and think about what was going on in the colonies at the same time. So the growth of British cities in the 19th century. Here you see a table, and please don't try and read all these numbers on here, but what you can see first of all on the left is the names of northern British cities from Glasgow, Newcastle, Leeds, Hull, Manchester, Liverpool, down to Sheffield in Yorkshire. So these are northern, formerly I would say, industrial cities. They're now sort of not so much heavy industry as service industries and so on in those places. But what you will see as you read along the top horizontally, you'll see that during the 19th century and up to the 20th century, there were huge increases in the populations of these cities. Okay, within 100 years, you get Leeds, for instance, 5-fold increase. and tenfold increase for Hull, and so on in 100 years. So the question for us linguists is, where does this, where do these populations come from? Are they migrants, or are they people who are born to the existing people? And what about language? What about the local English dialects we're talking about here? And that, I'm going to concentrate on that for a few minutes now. Right, so were these population increases caused by migration or natural change, or both? How does this impact on the formation of dialects? Because each of those, the cities I mentioned, has today its own highly identifiable dialect or accent. So you can, you could, just by stepping out of the train, you can tell which city you're in if you know something about the accents, and even if you don't. So and that's across a relatively small geographical area, probably no more than 300 kilometers north to south, much less than that east to west. You get this diversity. So where does the diversity come from? Okay, right. So the British Industrial Revolution saw large-scale socioeconomic and demographic change in Northern England, Southern Scotland, and South Wales, which is the bit that sticks out on the left of the island of Britain. There were new or massively expanded industries during the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and up to the mid-19th century. For instance, textiles, driven by cotton from the Caribbean, from Africa and Caribbean. Then iron was produced, still is produced in small amounts, driven by water power, then coal-powered steam, and then trade as well. So the wealth generated in the 18th was generated in the 18th century, was generated by the slave trade, and this is quite clear these days. So Britain was the world's first urbanized and industrialized country. So here are some figures that I came across. So in 1831, we find 34% of the population living in cities, and then 20 years later, 50%. 20 years after that, 80%, and then at the end of the 20th century, 90% of the population. So we are essentially fully urbanized, and there's a certain amount of middle-class people returning to the countryside, shall we say. So the primary industries are still there, in other words, agriculture, but on a much, much smaller scale and much more industrialized. But you can see the rapid growth of cities, which was unprecedented, actually. Okay, now, this is then, I'm going to show you some maps now. So we begin with, first of all, with what kind of industries existed in the 19th century. So this deals with employment in agriculture. So the darker areas on the left, this is 1851. So darker areas show a preponderance of agriculture in that particular region. So you have the bottom half, essentially, this is England, with then Wales out on the left in the middle, for those of you who don't know. And you can see then that large areas of Wales, and then at the top, Scotland, are rural, preponderance of rural industries. And then on the right, we have the same thing, but 60 years later, 1911, and you can see then that the only area that remains preponderance of agriculture is the north of Scotland. Okay, and the rest then is much more industrial. You can also see that there are some areas which are the dots on some different parts of central England and so on, where it's less than 10% of the population is working in agriculture, right? So a huge shift then in 60 years, and that was beginning already in the 18th century. So the obverse of this is employment in manufacturing in the same two dates. And so we have on the left, 1851, you can see the dark areas. So this is the darker, the higher the number, proportion of people working in industry. London is in the probably you can probably find London on the map, but it's the southeast of the country, is not particularly industrial at this time, and in fact it never has been particularly industrial. But we have the sort of the central areas. So the big dark area in the middle of England is Birmingham to the south and Manchester to the north, and Liverpool is in there as well, and Leeds also in there. And then a bit higher up on the map, on the right-hand side, you see Newcastle, and then higher up still, you see the Glasgow, Edinburgh area as well. And then further down, you see South Wales. So this shows, a portrayal then of an increase in the number of people, proportion of people involved in manufacturing at that time. I don't know what it would be today, but it would be a lot less than it was in 1911, when it was in its heyday, really, manufacturing. Right, we're now getting to some more interesting charts here. Now, this shows population growth. Okay, first of all, in the earlier time is from 1801 to 1851. You see percentage change. The darker the color, the greater the population change, or increase actually, or decrease. So on the left, you see that it's the black areas are represented are in South Wales, in the sort of middle of England, northeast of England, and in parts of Scotland. And then you see the same thing happening then in the second chart here, which is 18. So this is 1851 to 1901. I can't read the numbers because my image is planted on top of them. Anyway, so you can see then that this percentage change, so the darker the color, the greater the change, goes on into the 20th century. So the question is, where does this population come from? And also you can see, incidentally, a decrease in population represented on the right-hand map by dots. So these are the rural areas of England, Wales, and Scotland. So the question for us then questions are as follows. Massive population growth in the cities led to new expanding urban environments, no doubt about that. Each city today has a distinct dialect / accent. Are these completely new dialect or accents caused by migration? And, or are they something that exists already? What's the situation here? And we need to find out how much of the population growth in the cities is due to migration. All right. So here we see two charts which illustrate this. So on the left, we have natural increase from 1851 to 1911. And the darker the figure, the darker the shading, it signifies higher natural increase. And then if you look at the same time, 1851 to 1911, the change due to migration, this is actually not so much in terms of the increase, but there's a huge migration decrease, migration-driven decrease of population in the countryside, as you can see from the dots, the areas with the dots here. So there is certainly some migration-based increase in population, and especially around London this time, rather than the industrial areas. But there is certainly migration increase in the industrial areas as well here. So what do we find then? What's the answer to our question? Are these accents and dialects caused by migration? And the answer is yes, to some extent, but maybe not as much as we would have thought. But the migration was predominantly local, so a few kilometers, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, rather than 150 kilometers, or particularly from other countries. The overseas country that is strongly represented is Ireland, as you probably know. But these local migrations then to the big city, to what became big cities, they obviously spoke similar dialects. to what was appearing in the city. So their local dialects then contributed to the local city dialects that emerged. And that's the reason why there are so many dialects in different dialects in the cities of Great Britain. Partly migration driven, but to the extent it's migration, it's very low, it's very local, shall we say. Okay, switching back now to the colonies in the 19th century. What's going on here? We're going to focus on Africa here. Now, as European influence increased, European languages became entrenched as official languages within each colony, especially after the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference. Sorry, I didn't spot that. So this was a conference at which the warring European powers decided how to cut up Africa into their own spheres of influence. And the result of that is essentially to draw boundaries which are enforced today as different nations in Africa. And these boundaries often divided existing ethno-linguistic units, tribes, i.e. languages, so that you find in Ghana, for instance, the Akan language, which we mentioned previously, is also spoken in next door Ivory Coast. And then moving across to Nigeria, Yoruba is also spoken in the Republic of Benin, and so on. And this causes problems really at the borders in terms of allegiances and trade and so on. So another thing is that there's a disruption to existing hierarchies and hence linguistic practices. By this, I mean certainly the boundaries, geographical boundaries, but also the fact that English, French, and Portuguese then became the official languages of the African colonies. And that meant that the indigenous languages were somehow relegated in status. They lost functions. Okay. So then the post-colonial period from, well, I mean, I could put any dates here. I've put 1960, or at least I think I have. I can't exactly see it. Here we have new governments, mostly maintaining the linguistic status quo. So this consolidated the status of educated people who were proficient in the colonial language. So remember that administration was of European style administration, which was bureaucratic, which then required writing, record keeping, and so on. That had not been a tradition or an issue in Africa until the Europeans came. They had their own administrative systems, including, I mean, as we know now, quite major empires in West Africa and Southern Africa. So anyway, so writing then became the thing, and writing was not available in the African languages. It is today in many African languages, but not at this time. Now, today, from the 1960s onwards, the post-colonial setup is that a local language is generally used as a medium of instruction in primary 1 to 3. And thereafter, it's the official language. English, French, Portuguese is a medium of instruction. Okay, so this is still a heavily disputed thing. Educationists want to encourage the use of local languages as languages of literacy. The problem with that is, although it brings psychological learning benefits to children to learn in their own language, but parents are often, and others, see the potential for the erosion of the status of the official languages through that. And so campaigns, efforts to extend the use of indigenous languages in education generally fail. There's a lot of disputes and campaigns and so on all around the continent on this. Right, this is the book I was referring to. Urban Contact, Dialects and Language Change, Insights from the Global North and South. And it contains chapters on youth varieties across sub-Saharan Africa and Northwest Europe. Okay, so the empire strikes back. I guess most of you will have, even though it was a long time ago now, know what this is referring to. So Star Wars. Post-World War II, large-scale immigration from the former colonies to Britain, France, and the Netherlands took place. And so we see this, and I'm going to be talking about the situation in Britain, more specifically London, in what follows. Very similar things have been going on elsewhere in Europe. It's not just the former colonies, but very often it is. So we find in France a lot of people from the Maghreb, so North Africa, countries like Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco coming in. They had been French colonies, and French had been the language of education in those countries. So they arrive in France. In the Netherlands, people come from Suriname, Indonesia, those places. And in Britain, people come from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, West Africa, East Africa, those regions, which are traditionally thought of as Anglophone. That just means that English is the language of education in those places. So this tells us something about the share of UK population that was born abroad. From early census periods, not the first census, but from 1851 up until 2018. And you can see a steady rise. So to begin with, only less than 0.5% or something of the population was born abroad in 1851, and that then rises almost exponentially up to the present, where now around about 15% of the population is born in another country. Okay. And then there are figures, of course, for where that was, which countries that was. The major immigration that I'm going to be talking about started in time for 1951, and then through the 60s and 70s. Okay, so that's when these new language varieties I'm going to be talking about emerged. Okay, so the migration then began in time for the 1951 census, with the arrival of a ship called the Empire Windrush in 1948, which contained, I'm not quite sure, 300, 400 people, mostly from Jamaica, but also from elsewhere in the Caribbean. And here's a press photograph of some of the young men who came from Jamaica, okay, looking very smart and dapper in their suits. So these then present a positive image quite clearly for these people who then settled, suffered various forms of discrimination and so on in the years that followed. So now, what about the migrants themselves, the proportions? Who were they? Well, this is a chart from a publication from 1995. So West Indian, that's Caribbean, and then Indian and Pakistani. So you can see then that in the 1940s and 50s, there wasn't very much going on until the mid-50s. And then you see the West Indian population increasing first of all, until a peak in the late 60s. No, hang on, a peak in 1960. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong line here. And then it goes down. And then after that, we have people from India and Pakistan, and then Bangladesh, which is not exactly included here, but of course it was part of Pakistan until I think 1970. What this chart doesn't tell us is the West African component of migration, which is probably the largest. It's not the largest at the moment, but I think until recently the Poles were people from Poland were the biggest migratory group, and Polish is still the second most spoken language in Britain, with less the people who stayed, the Poles who stayed in this country. So we have, a lot, relatively large migrations of people, and as I said, this chart leaves out Africa. Okay, but I'm going to look at some of the British Asian people, and not in London, but in Bradford, which is a city in Yorkshire, not that far from, about an hour and a half's drive from where I'm sitting now. So Bradford, 25 of the population of the city of Bradford, population 500,000, identifies as British Asian. So this is a box that people can tick on the census form. And British Asian refers to Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, and Sri Lankan as well. So of this 25% of the population as British Asian, 42% claim to speak a South Asian language as their main language. And that's Punjabi. As the way migration worked in Bradford and several other cities is that it's a kind of chain migration. So people came across from certain parts of Pakistan, in this case, to Bradford, in this case, to work in the cotton mills in the 50s and 60s, producing cloth. That industry is gone now, so the people are now have all sorts of other kinds of occupations. Okay, so 42%, just under half of them, claimed to speak a South Asian language as their main language, and this would have been in, I think, 2011, which was the last census. There is something called Bradford Asian English, which has many distinctive phonetic features, mostly derived from Punjabi, and Jessica Wormold did a study of this. Now, depending on individual social networks and continued immigration, Punjabi is gradually being lost to a greater or lesser extent. So it's on the way out, but fairly slowly. This is an example of a single immigrant ethno-linguistic group creating some sort of cultural continuity by settling in one place. There has been a continued language shift to English, but this results in a Punjabi ethnolectal English, Bradford Asian English in this case. Okay, so this is to do with social networks, social contacts, and so on. But English is now by far the main language of this group. Okay, so that's one effect of one kind of migration from a former colony. Okay, one language, one ethnic group, and one location. But elsewhere in the country, in London particularly, we get something very different. And this is what I'm calling contact-driven change in Western Europe from 1960 to today. So there are a whole lot of new, what we call urban contact dialects in Northwest Europe. And these start out as youth languages. Okay, so contact dialects of English, that is, or of another European language. They live in highly linguistically mixed neighborhoods in the big cities, and you can contrast this with the Punjabis in Bradford. And these languages rather, are classified as multi-ethnolects. So we talked about ethnolectal English in Bradford, but this is multi-ethnolect. So this is something that's then a distillation, shall we say, of many different kinds of language. Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, France, UK, these are the regions of Northwest Europe where such varieties have emerged. One of them is Multicultural London English, MLE, which I've been involved with research on, as Ariane mentioned. A couple of years ago, I decided to construct this webpage here which is at the University of York website. It's meant for teachers and students, other interested people, and that's there and available. There are references there as well. Okay, the study that we did in from 2004 onwards, nearly 20 years ago now, was based mainly in the London borough of Hackney. This chart shows the various ethnic groups, percentages of various ethnic groups in Hackney. And you can see the largest is the white British, 44%, but then all the rest are various Caribbean, African, and Indian subcontinental origins, and of course languages too. So let's have a look at some features of multicultural London English. We have, first of all, grammatical change. So bare NPs with verbs of motion. This will become clear when I show you the examples here. So people in London who speak multicultural London English would say things like, they go skating rinks instead of they go to skating rinks. I used to go to Stratford instead of I used to go to Stratford. All right. So this is a feature that is quite, it is very, very common. It is spreading to non-minority ethnic speakers, white British speakers as well. It's widely commented on in the media and by parents who are not, who come from somewhere else in England, who notice that their kids use this construction. Okay. Other grammatical changes, well, there's a new pronoun, man, meaning I, but it's a sort of, can also be used as an impersonal pronoun. It can also be used as in the plural as well. I'll give you an example. I hope I can play it to you in a few moments. Then radical changes in vowel pronunciation. So I'll just illustrate these for you. Just have a listen to this, okay? So in traditional London, the vowel of a word like face. So, okay, so I suppose my accent is an RP type, received pronunciation type accent. So I say face. Traditional London would be face, so more of an I type sound. In MLE, Multicultural London English, it's face, almost a monophony, A. The goat vowel, so O would be my pronunciation. Gout, something like that would be a traditional London pronunciation, and goat, O, is an MLE pronunciation of that. And then you find lots of Jamaican and African American slang. So wagwan, ends, bruv, feds. So wagwan is a greeting, means, where are you going? But it means how, how's things. Ends means a local area. Bruv is an address term. Feds is an American term, which means police. Right, and I'm going to try to play an example of man. And this also, you can also listen to some of this young man's accent features too. So here we go.
I don't mind how my girl, I don't really mind how my girl looks. If she looks decent, yeah, and there's one bit of her face that just looks mashed, yeah, I don't care. It's her personality man's looking at. I'm not even looking at the girl proper like.
So we can try to decide whether this man is I, or whether it's more impersonal. One is looking at. I think it's first person here. But then he repeats it, and he says, man's not even looking at the girl proper like. So this is an innovation. It is based on a Jamaican construction, Jamaican Creole construction, but it's very much, it's developed its own way in London in the last 20 years or so. Right. Okay, so what languages have, before I go on to what languages have influenced multicultural London English, I must just mention one form, and that is the plural of things like man and girl in MLE is actually mandem, girldem in many cases, particularly as spoken by young Black people. So people of Caribbean origin and people of West African origin, they say things like mandem, which is a Creole form. Okay, what languages could have influenced MLE? Well, we have Caribbean Creoles, but also ex-colonial Englishes from Africa, India, Caribbean. Learner varieties of English, L2 varieties of English, the local London dialect, also known as Cockney, and varieties encountered in the school, so standard English, teachers' varieties. I mean, teachers would have local accents very often. They wouldn't have RP necessarily. They might even speak something that's not standard English. And then media. So we have TV, way back, of course, in the old days, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, popular music. I'll come back to popular music in just a few moments. But monolingual speakers of English have also been exposed to these varieties. So MLE is therefore shared across ethnic and language backgrounds. But there's a proviso there. Even so, there are ethnic differences, and they are connected with Black culture and particularly music culture. MLE is strongly associated with grime music, and this is a form of London hip hop that appeared in around about the year 2000. So prominent performers are Dizzy Rascal, who's for the first famous single, Boy in the Corner, 2003, and then Stormzy, more recently, Shut Up. And these two guys are both of Ghanaian origin, actually, second, third generation, if you like, Londoners. And so these are very prominent. Their language is multicultural London English. They have the pronunciation. The pronunciations I just talked about. They use the pronoun man in their lyrics, and they use the Jamaican and African American slang terms. And here you see wagwan, yardi, batty man, which means gay, mandem, boydem, brethren. Okay, those last ones are Caribbean. And of course, notably, Dizzy Rascal and Stormzy don't have any links with the Caribbean, any ancestral links with the Caribbean, but they've adopted this way of speaking. Across Europe, it's not, Britain isn't by any means unique here. Urban contact dialects or multi-ethnics are associated with hip hop, and we find something similar in America as well, with hip hop being black. I mean, many of the artists are black in America. Okay, so that's Britain. Switch back to Africa. What's going on in post-World War II Africa? Massive migration to cities across the continent, led by Nigeria. A huge population increase, so the birth rate has remained high. Cities across Africa are now extremely multilingual, in the same way that London is. But there isn't often in Africa, there isn't a majority language that is like there is in London, which is English, of course. Okay, so new youth languages in late 20th century Africa. Post-colonial language situation is that we have the former colonizers' language with official status. And then urbanization, I've already mentioned, the growth of languages of wider communication. So Swahili in East Africa, Lingala in Central Africa, Hausa in West Africa. And the urban settings allow for the development of adolescent peer groups in a way that doesn't really exist in rural areas of Africa. So the youth languages are transformations of what I've just mentioned. And then you find things like the legitimacy of standard French is subverted by its use as a base for Nushi in the Ivory Coast and Camfranglais in Cameroon. So I'd recommend you go online to YouTube and have a good listen, search around for things in these languages. There's a lot of it about, and a lot of it is music, hip hop as well. And then Swahili is the basis for Nairobi Sheng. Okay, but the origins of these are in criminal argos and countercultural youth groups. Okay, they're now being promoted, if you like. And they've been promoted from resistance identities to project identities and beyond. Before I go on to that, I'll say I'll probably speak for another 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll have a rest and then some questions. Okay, so African youth languages have all made the transition from being anti-languages associated with countercultural resistance identities to symbolizing positive, more mainstream project identities. Where do these terms resistance and project come from? There's a Spanish sociologist called Castells, Catalan, he's a Catalan, who came up with this idea of resistance identity as being something that you put up in order to exclude other people. And it's often used by people who are underprivileged in one way or another, who don't want the higher up authorities to actually be aware of what they're doing. But then there's a promotion, if you like, transition to project identities, which are something more positive, shall we say. So there's a strong, with these languages now, there's a strong association in Africa with hip hop and rap. The languages may also be used by young adults, and they now appear widely in print, especially on the internet. And here's an example from Cameroon. So this is a Facebook group called Ici on topo le confranglais, le speech des vrais mains de Mbois. Now, if you see the blend here of French and English, so mainly French, some English, but also some words that are neither. And just cast your eyes, I won't try and read this. If you know French, you'll get somewhere with what this says here. Otherwise, I don't think you will if you don't know French. Basically, it's French, but there's a lot of vocabulary here that isn't French, and some of it is also English. So the second line, we have the word life here instead of vie, which it would be. So that's actually used then in a Facebook group. Okay, now what about migration in Africa? And what this chart shows, I won't go through this in detail, but what it tells us is that most migration in Africa is actually within Africa and also within the region of Africa. And then I can also say that most migration is actually within country, not from other countries in Africa. So in Ghana, for instance, there's migration from the north, which is relatively poor, to the south, where people see economic opportunities. And that leads to the increased multilingualism of Accra. So Kenya, Kenya's, so the capital city, Nairobi. So this is from an article in the book I mentioned. Well, actually, the examples are not necessarily, but in the 1960s to 70s in the slums of Nairobi, young people created an anti-language, which became called Sheng on the basis of spoken Swahili, as we already mentioned. It's become popular among Kenyan youth, mainly through music. But it's also seen as a marker of modernness, modern Kenyanness, so post-colonial national identity, if you like, even though Sheng is disparaged as being bad Swahili. It now appears in advertising and social media, and you can find COVID-19 campaigns in English, Swahili, and also in Sheng, some sort of recognition because of the multilingual ethos of the country that these other languages, even if they're not official like Sheng at all, Swahili is, but not Sheng, are actually useful vehicles for communication. And there's ongoing lexical innovation and expansion from both English and other Kenyan languages. So in an article from 2010, we find the following. This was based on an ethnography of Sheng speakers in Nairobi, or should we say people in Nairobi, not necessarily Sheng speakers. But this is from particular informal settlements. Okay, so there's high turnover of population, very high turnover of population, and the majority of the slum dwellers are actually short-term migrants, spending on average less than 3 years in the area. So these are areas where they would pick up Sheng. They're probably not originally Sheng speakers; they're from somewhere else. And migration is more intense during early adulthood, as we might expect. And mobility seems to be more intense among women compared to men. And that's an interesting fact. Okay, so in these communities, extreme levels of instability, social instability, mean that there are many languages spoken there. And you can certainly characterize these communities as high contact, if you remember Anderson's idea of high contact versus low contact. Kenya is multilingual, 2 official languages, and the multilingual ethos, as I've already mentioned, tolerates Sheng, even though Sheng is not officially encouraged. Now, switch to the Asian continent, China, for our closing part of this. Migration patterns of China, current migrations, are the largest in the world, apparently. So this is actually within China. And there's also massive recent urbanization, which took place 100 years after European urbanization and 150 years after British urbanization. So what linguistic changes can we expect? I'm going to try to cover these points. Okay, so China's urban population reached 781 million in 2017, accounting for over half the population, 57%. And the rural population was over 80% until 1980. Just think about that, okay? Very quick turnaround from almost entirely rural to the numbers by 2020 had gone down to 40% rural. And here's a chart that shows this, okay? So this chart shows the percent rural population. So the percentages go from, look at the scale on the right-hand side, from 30 up to 90. So you can see how the percentage reduced from, as I've said, 80 down to 40, okay, in a very short space of time. So that is a huge migration. The population across this particular time has remained fairly stable in China because of the policies that the government had. Okay, so how does this translate to China itself? So this is a map which shows China. It shows this shows migrations basically. So the green parts are outflows of population. So people leaving that particular province going to go somewhere else. So the darker the green, the higher the proportion left. And then inflows, so this ranges from pink to dark, some sort of dark red color. So what you can see is that the migrations are actually from the central provinces to the coast, the east coast, and then also to a small extent to Xinjiang and Tibet, but these are have much smaller populations. So Inner Mongolia loses population, Henan and so on also lose population to the coast. So this is one thing that can be shown. Okay, and what about the linguistics of this? Well, there has been a study by a Dutch linguist called Marinus van den Berg, who has looked at populations in Xi'an and also in Shanghai. So this is Xi'an. So let me just explain what this chart means. And this is the last chart, by the way. So this was based on a questionnaire survey of a few hundred people. About a couple hundred people. So the categories here along the top, where it says language behavior. So this is N, that's number, PTH, Putonghua, and then Xi'an dialect, Shaanxi dialect, which is the province, and then Henan dialect, which is a neighboring province, then other, and then the bilinguals, that column. And so the numbers are percentages that add up to 100. So the first languages that are claimed, okay, what we find is that 21% claim Xi'an dialect as their first language, 38% claim Shaanxi dialect, which is the province that Xi'an is located in. And then what language do they use at home? Well, it tends to be Putonghua, 24%, but also dialect as well. Not necessarily the first language though. So what do they use in Xi'an? So this means, in the streets, going shopping and things like that. Putonghua, overwhelmingly, over half the population speak Putonghua, but there's some use of the other languages too. What they regard as their best language, or what, not quite sure what this means, the best, whether that's what they consider the best or whether it's their best language, their own best language. Putonghua figures quite prominently there as well. And what do they use at work? Well, 68.9% use Putonghua, so standard Chinese, okay, and then much less the dialects. So what this is, the way Van den Berg summarizes this is that, or rather sort of the way we can summarize his work is that there's a long history of multidialectalism and standard varieties. And there's multiple layers of migration and language in this city as in other cities. There's overlapping speech and discourse community. So a discourse community is sort of like a context, if you like, a work context. So overall, Putonghua is favored at work and other dialects elsewhere, okay? So that gives you a snapshot based on a questionnaire survey of a typical large Chinese city. So to sum up, we've taken a sort of 300-year look at migration from very much a Western European perspective. We've seen multiple social, the multiple social, economic, and linguistic disruptions of the Atlantic slave trade, and the effects that had for Africa, the Caribbean, the Americas generally, and Western Europe. Okay, so huge repercussions even now. 19th and 20th centuries, and I'd say the 21st, maybe too, are still marked by the slave trade. So the wealth of Europe, please note the wealth of Europe and the USA versus the poverty of what are now labeled developing or global South countries. There are now in all countries new social and linguistic hierarchies, themselves still the outcome of colonialism, particularly in places like Africa and Jamaica, that may be mitigated by vibrant new cultures that I've been talking about in terms of multi-ethnolects and new African youth languages and so on. And finally, the massive recent migrations in Africa, India and China lead to new multilingualisms. So thank you very much. I'll close there. I'm not quite sure what we should do at this stage.